Fluent Flow podcast. New videos every day. Let's learn English together.
Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today, well, it really centers on a core strategy you see in a lot of language learning material, how we get to fluency through daily practice.
Right. And the source material we're looking at, it doesn't just suggest this, it provides a pretty specific directive. It advocates, quite strongly actually, for the idea that small, simple daily habits are, well, the best method.
Exactly. That word best. That's where the friction really is, I think. So the central question for our debate today is this. Does consistently applying these small, low-stress, sort of micro-learning habits, does that really constitute the most effective path, the optimal path to fluency? Or, does this gentler approach maybe lack the necessary structural challenge, the intensity you need for, let's say, advanced skills?
And yeah, we need to explore if consistency just on its own is actually enough without that intensity piece.
So I'll be arguing that focusing on these small daily habits is fundamentally the optimal strategy, especially for the long term. I'm going to emphasize the crucial role of neurological retention and, importantly, sustainability in the whole process.
Okay. And I'll be challenging that specific assertion, best. Because while I agree these small habits are, vital for keeping momentum going and avoiding burnout, I'm going to argue that relying only on these low-stress, simple tasks, it ultimately leads to those really frustrating proficiency plateaus. It just fails, in my view, to provide the deep, focused engagement you really need for a high-level command of the language. I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle.
I can see why you might think that, particularly if maybe speed is the top priority. But let me offer a different perspective, one grounded more in the mechanics of memory. My core argument is that daily, small-scale practice is actually superior precisely because it leverages these principles of frequency and spaced repetition.
Okay.
The pedagogy material illustrates this really quite beautifully. When practice is done every day, even for just 5 minutes, it says, the brain remembers better. And that's the neurological principle of long-term potentiation. Right there, strengthening pathways through frequent low-dose activation. It compares this effort to, the effective daily habit of brushing your teeth.
That analogy is compelling for maintenance, I grant you that. But I think it kind of breaks down when you apply it to acquisition or, significant growth. When you learn to brush your teeth, you learn the skill once, basically, and then you just maintain it daily. Language fluency, though, that requires continually incorporating complex new systems, new grammar, new tenses, new vocabulary, not just maintaining what you already know. The initial learning, I think, often requires a dedicated intensity that, brushing your teeth just doesn't.
But this strategy, by keeping practice simple and calm, it directly addresses the single biggest killer of language learning attempts, stress and then, people quitting. By removing that psychological burden-like feeling you have to open a textbook for 2 solid hours, it makes the practice sustainable. And that is the key long-term advantage. 10 minutes daily, it adds up, right? Almost 5 hours in a month. This cumulative, stress-free volume ensures longevity and therefore pretty much guarantees results over time.
That's a fair point about the psychological side, the sustainability. But we really have to consider the, let's say, intellectual cost of defining best as simply easiest. While these small habits are definitely necessary for building momentum, yet defining them as the optimal path overlooks, I think, the absolute requirement for structured challenge. That's what you need for true fluency, especially for learners trying to push past that, say, B2 intermediate level. My concern really centers on this critique of simplicity. The methods that get emphasized, like write one short sentence daily, they inherently prioritize ease over any kind of structural complexity. We need to ask, I think, whether a routine based on continually practicing only simple, basic sentences, structures the learner probably already mastered, will ever provide sufficient exposure to the sophisticated stuff, like conditional clauses or complex word forms or the abstract vocabulary you need for advanced communication.
But the brain has to establish the routine first, doesn't it? Without excessive cognitive load. We're talking about building a foundation for action here, and that foundation really needs to be low friction to even get started.
Perhaps initially, yes, but the ultimate goal is fluency, right? And that requires engagement that goes beyond these perpetually low-stress activities. It has to actively challenge the learner's existing knowledge base, creating what, learning science sometimes calls desirable difficulty. The material seems to minimize this necessary, challenging effort, almost entirely in favor of just maximizing enjoyment. If the practice is always simple, the brain just doesn't see any reason to reorganize or evolve its language system.
Okay, let's examine that exact point then. This potential conflict between structural complexity and simple repetition.
Right, so I challenge the long-term effectiveness of just writing one short sentence every single day. While, yes, it establishes consistency, the serious risk here is the fossilization of those simple structures. For someone at an intermediate level, focusing only on structures they already know, simple present, basic SVO sentences, it actively prevents them from grappling with compound sentences, dependent clauses, or say the nuances of perfect tenses. If the goal is advanced communication, that simple habit can easily become a comfortable but ultimately limiting intellectual rut.
That's an interesting point about fossilization, yeah, but I'd frame it quite differently by focusing on the developmental nature of the practice. The simple sentence, I see it as the necessary entry point. The primary goal, right at the beginning, is establishing the habit itself, reducing the friction until writing feels just like part of your life, not some kind of test or assignment. Once that act of writing daily is firmly established, then the cognitive energy that was previously spent just forcing the routine, that can be redirected towards increasing complexity. You can't really worry about mastering the subjunctive mood until the basic act of writing itself is, reflexive.
I understand the importance of making the habit reflexive. I do. But if the routine itself is just insufficiently challenging, then progress stalls, regardless of how consistent you are. I worry that for a, let's say, highly motivated learner, the daily simple sentence might provide comfort, sure, but not the necessary struggle required for real structural growth. The material almost seems to suggest that the habit alone solves the entire learning problem, which, frankly, I just don't buy.
Then let's look at the methods for input. Specifically, this question of passive versus active practice. I would strongly defend the passive methods that are listed, like listening to English audio while you walk, cook, or relax, or watching movies with subtitles. These methods, they ensure constant, almost ambient exposure, and they make practice enjoyable, which fulfills the material's directive to make it fun. This constant high-volume input, even if it feels passive, is actually crucial for building receptive fluency.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that maximizing time by, integrating listening while doing something else necessarily equates to deep learning. Let me explain why. Multitasking, by its very nature, reduces active cognitive engagement. It splits your attention. You simply cannot encode complex auditory or linguistic input effectively if, half your brain power is focused on chopping onions or navigating rush hour. I really question if this kind of low-focus, simultaneous activity achieves the necessary depth of processing, especially when you compare it to dedicated focused study time, which the material seems to implicitly downplay in favor of this low-stress integration idea.
But that low-focus aspect, that's precisely its strength for the busy learner. It converts what would otherwise be dead time, commuting, cooking, cleaning, into potentially productive learning time, crucially, without adding psychological stress. The cumulative impact of that consistent ambient exposure, it builds critical receptive skills, phonological awareness, intonation patterns, all essential for fluency, even if the engagement isn't maybe 100% active all the time. We're talking about volume here and consistent input, which I think can overcome the limitation of imperfect attention sometimes.
Volume is important, yes, but if the input is only processed at a very shallow depth, it often just becomes noise, doesn't it? For deep learning, which involves actually encoding meaning and structure, you need focused attention. If a learner is constantly relying only on passive, ambient methods, they might build up excellent receptive skills, sure, but they could fail to develop the active production and the rapid retrieval skills needed for spontaneous conversation. And that demands higher intensity, focused practice.
Which brings us, I think, directly to our final point of contention. Defining fluency through sheer cumulative volume, which the material kind of suggests can be achieved with just 70 minutes a week of these micro habits, versus the potential necessity of, well, intensity.
Exactly.
I have to emphasize the mathematical power of small, unwavering habits. 70 minutes per week, built day by day, consistently. That translates to substantial, stress-free progress over the long haul, over years even. The material's evidence points to this being a lot of practice without stress. This cumulative volume, built on that unwavering consistency, I believe is the defining factor for achieving genuine flow, because flow often comes from time on task.
Okay, I acknowledge the power of cumulative volume, of course, but I have to ask, does 70 minutes spent reading a menu and writing 7 very simple sentences each week, does that truly move a dedicated learner past that difficult intermediate plateau? I'd suggest that the material is maybe conflating sustainability with optimal efficacy. Specific, intensive training sessions, things like rapid, unprepared conversation practice, or focused drills on complex syntax, which are often excluded if you strictly adhere to a small habits-only philosophy, I think those are necessary to force structural breakthroughs and actually accelerate fluency development. The volume might be there, yes, but the intellectual pressure just isn't.
But the simple habit is merely the reliable delivery mechanism, isn't it? It guarantees the learner shows up every day. If those intensive methods lead to burnout and the learner quits after 3 months because the pressure was just too high, well, the small habit learner, the one who continues steadily for 3 years, they always win the fluency race in the end. Sustainability guarantees results, long-term.
But the quality and the actual design of the practice determines the speed and the final level of those results. For many adult learners operating under really severe time constraints, maybe the best path should prioritize efficiency maximizing speed while still maintaining enough sustainability. Intensive, focused training sessions address that efficiency need directly, which is something the material seems almost willing to sacrifice entirely just for the sake of comfort.
I still maintain that the material's core approach, small, sustainable, enjoyable habits, is fundamentally the best long-term mechanism. It ensures continuity, it supports robust neurological retention, and crucially, it prevents the psychological fatigue that derails so many language learners. This consistent foundation is, to me, non-negotiable.
And I absolutely concede the necessary role of these daily habits, particularly for initial development and for sustained engagement over time. They are essential, like keeping the engine running, as you said. However, I must maintain that pursuing true advanced fluency eventually demands periodic, deliberate shifts towards more intensive, structurally complex challenges that really transcend the material's heavy emphasis on continuous, low-stress simplicity.
Well, this has certainly been a fascinating look at that tension between consistency and intensity in language learning. We've explored the differences between, say, passive, high-volume input and focused, deep cognitive engagement.
Indeed. The discussion, I think, clearly illuminates that the path someone chooses fundamentally depends on whether they prioritize that psychological sustainability above everything else, or if they're willing, perhaps, to introduce periods of higher intellectual pressure specifically for accelerated structural progress.
It seems we agree then that the truly optimal strategy for fluency might ultimately depend quite heavily on the learner's specific goals. Are they aiming for long-term maintenance or perhaps rapid, high-level mastery? And, of course, their current stage of acquisition.
So we leave the listener to weigh those benefits of unwavering consistency against the potential necessity of intensity when they chart their own path toward language fluency.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.